Hello, this is John Tures, Professor of Political Science at LaGrange College, and I thought I'd get you the story for today for 3D Journeys at LaGrange College. And this is called Is This a Five-Star Government? And you'll understand why I call it five-star in a little bit. And if you hear some music in the background just to sort of set the tone, I am playing the soundtrack from the 2000 movie Gladiator, composed by Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerrard. And I know from Dottie Joyner's presentation that Gladiator is not the most realistic movie to talk about the Roman Empire, but I figured the music is pretty good, and we'll be on safe terms there. There won't be any historical inaccuracies with the movie. Uh, as you can see from the beginning slide, the map of the United States, just so you can see how big Italy is in comparison. Now, whenever you look at a map of Europe, Italy looks pretty big, but that means it's pretty big compared to, or it looks pretty big compared to other European countries. If you were to drive the distance of Italy, as you can see there, northern Italy would be about Nebraska. If you went down to the southern boot, you'd be somewhere between Oklahoma on one side and Arkansas on the other. Which should give you some perspective. I mean, that's still pretty big, but compared to going coast to coast in the United States, not counting Alaska and Hawaii, it is the size it is. The story I want to tell you about, I was raised Catholic in El Paso, Texas, and I went to school in San Antonio. And the story I came across years ago was not long before I started college, there was a bishop who he had to cover the territory for San Antonio, Houston, and Dallas, Texas, if you've ever been out there. And so between these three cities, getting around was pretty difficult. So he requested funds to purchase a car. And the folks in the Vatican, who obviously in Italy, wrote back and they said, wouldn't a bicycle be more practical? Well, if you've ever been out in Texas, as I have, and I drove amongst all the cities because I had friends in these towns, it's about a 5-hour drive from San Antonio to Dallas, about a 4-hour drive from Dallas to Houston, and to come back from Houston to San Antonio, that's a 3-hour drive. That's all by car. I mean, you can imagine a bishop on a bicycle trying to make it. He'd need to be like Greg LeMond or Lance Armstrong or somebody like that just to pull it off, and even then it wouldn't be easy. So I just wanted to give that perspective in terms of size of the two countries. Italy's pretty big for Europe, but compared to the United States, it's a little bit on the smaller side. It won't be the last time that I make a comparison between Italy and the United States. In fact, comparative politics is one of the areas that I teach in, and so we're always looking at the similarities and differences between countries. You'll see that throughout these slides. The relationship the two have. Now, one of the biggest misconceptions we have about Europe and America is that Europe is very old and America is very young. Well, I mean, there were certainly cities where, that were much older than some of the more modern looking cities you see in the United States. So it feeds into the myth that Europe is much older than America. Of course, the Native Americans were building some pretty impressive civilizations too, as well as others in the Americas during the same time. But in terms of a country and a state, as in the political entity in charge of a country, Italy is actually 100 years younger than the United States. I mean, there was an Italian peninsula, and there were cities like Rome and Milan and Turin, and Genoa and Venice long before Columbus was making discoveries in the United States. But that doesn't mean that Italy as a country is as old as the United States. In fact, it's much younger. So that's what there was no Italy. There was an Italian peninsula, like I said, but there was no Italy until about the 1870s. So almost 100 years after the United States. Now think about it where we were 100 years ago. So it's 2020, so we're talking about the era of 1918 to like the 1920s, moving into the 30s. What was America involved in? I give you some suggestions on slide 2. There is the progressive movement. There's World War I, the Spanish flu. You also had the Prohibition era. You had organized crime, Teapot Dome scandal, and that's even before the Great Depression and World War II. So Italy's where we were 100 years ago in terms of growing pains. And that won't be too surprising when you see their political history, which I start about the 1870s. So Italy's origin story, you got to think about what Italy was before. And when I show maps of Italy to students beforehand, and Germany too, they look very surprised because the time of the Declaration of Independence, Italy looked very different. Even in the 1840s, as you can see on this slide number 3, there was a peninsula, a big old peninsula, but there was no modern Italy. You see a lot of divided regions on there. You see Piedmont, Lombardy, Tuscany, Sardinia, the Kingdom of Naples and the two Sicilies. You see the Papal States, and those are just the ones I'm naming. I mean, there are a number of other smaller Italian states that were their own country. But the game changer came with Italian revolutionaries. A tale of two Giuseppes, so to speak. You had Giuseppe Garibaldi. He provided the brawn. He was the revolutionary, the organizer, who could get people together to fight against those who were dominating Italy, as well as states who didn't like to go along with the idea of a bigger Italy. They wanted to keep to themselves. And so Garibaldi would battle them. Because remember, France and Austria each had major holdings in Italy as well. The brains come from Giuseppe Mazzini, who I have my students read about. And he's not the father of nationalism, but he's one of the first architects of nationalism as a political policy. And his argument was every nation deserves a state. Now you're going to ask, well, wait, what's a nation? I thought that was a country. And we use terms like state, country, nation interchangeably. But in political science, nation is a group that sees itself as unique, separate from everyone else. It could be an ethnic group. It could be a religious group. It could be a regional group. But regardless, there are a lot of different ways to define a nation. But these are groups who see themselves as independent from everyone else. And Giuseppe Mazzini felt that there was this Italian nation that was out there, and it deserved to be its own country. And so they absorbed other states in, and they decided to fight against the foreign powers who were dominating. This isn't too far from my origin story, as my relatives were up in the Alps, or as the story goes. And though they were of a German family, as borders change, you get to see where Austria is at the northeast corner of where modern-day Italy is, up in the Alps. And next thing you know, that area, the Tyrolean region, where the Germans were plentiful, suddenly became under Italian power. And so my family, I think that's either where we changed the name or something like that. But that's some of where my last name came from, because the region around there is called Campo Tures. So I've been very interested in this kind of thing. Once the nation is united, the foreign powers are defeated. King Victor Emmanuel II is crowned the first king of the new country, Italy. If you want to see what he looked like, look up at the northeast corner where he is pictured with his wife. Now, if you've ever been to Rome, there's something called the Wedding Cake Memorial, and that is to the first king, Victor Emmanuel II. And it's a very garish looking monument. I remember seeing it when I was there, and I thought, oh yeah, I remember reading that he's the first king of Italy, but he's not from like the 1300s or 1400s. He's from the 1800s, and late 1800s at that. Fast forward to Italy during the World Wars. We're just not looking at every single government and regime, but just sort of their pivotal periods of time. During World War I, or just before World War I, Italy was part of a group called the Central Powers. It was known as the Triple Alliance. And these other countries in this alliance were Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire as well. But they switched and they joined the Triple Entente, which is Britain, France, and Russia, later known as the Allied Powers. And This was a big shock to the system, as everyone expected Italy would back Germany, another new country, and Austro-Hungary, who was just looking for any ally. But as the story goes, Italy had received private assurances from the Triple Entente that if they joined the Allied powers, Britain, France, and the others would recognize territory from the Austro-Hungarian Empire that Italy could absorb. So Italy's job was to attack Austria, the southern part of Austria, and to move east. Russia would be fighting, and France and Britain would be fighting against Germany. This would be a very important part. This would be the southern front. But what happened was Italy was not the game changer the Allies thought they would be. They did not fight particularly well against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you zoom in on the map that I included in the central part, that is the World War I map, where it looks kind of mustard yellow and kind of like a light chocolate, like milk chocolate brown. The yellow being Italy and the brown being Austro-Hungary. There was some fighting along the border, but very little was gained or lost. They basically fought part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to a standstill, and not as much was accomplished. Italy did not go smashing through the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They did not knock out anything. They did not take Vienna. They didn't get very much. Most people don't see Italy's ability to fight in that war as a very positive thing. And so when the Treaty of Versailles was around, I think the guy's name was Vittoriano Orlando, the prime minister. When he showed up at the Vienna conference, you'll see pictures of the big four. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. You'll see Prime Minister Orlando, Georges Clemenceau from France, and U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. But in all the negotiations, Italy got very little territory in response for their efforts. And they were pretty upset because they thought they were going to get a lot of stuff by switching sides, but they did not. And some of the anger and resentment, as well as some of the economic problems Italy experienced after World War I, many people believe, led to fascism and Benito Mussolini coming to power. Il Duce, this dictator who joined the Axis powers. Now, before World War II, Italy was known for beating up on other countries. They beat up on Abyssinia, which is modern-day Ethiopia, and Albania. And they also sent troops to the Spanish Civil War to help Nazi Germany and the Spanish Phalangists, the hardcore nationalists, go after the Liberal Republic in Spain. Italian troops did not fight particularly well. The biggest military engagement I can remember reading about, because I did a paper about the Spanish Civil War, Mussolini's troops were knocked back by the Spanish Republicans, and they did not perform as well. So more military might was needed before the Spanish Republic could be overrun. But Italy didn't live up to expectations in those conflicts. And they were able to beat up on some smaller troops or smaller countries. Ethiopia, very low-tech military. Albania, pretty small. But in fact, Italy also moved from Albania to try and attack Greece, and they bungled that very badly. Greece actually threw back the Italian forces, and I believe took even a chunk of Albania with them. And so Hitler had to come down and help bail out Italy in that military adventure. Italian troops struggled in North Africa. Those conflicts, remember, Libya used to be an Italian colony. But they did not perform as well compared to the Germans fighting in Italy. Sure enough, once all of North Africa was taken, Allied forces were able to take Sicily. If you've ever seen the Patton movie, there's a lot of time spent in Sicily, as well as the race between Patton and Bernard Montgomery, who would get to Messina first. But then you also saw the invasion of Italy. If you've heard of conflicts like Anzio, the bloody struggle as the Allied forces moved their way up Italy. Mark Clark was the U.S. general who captured Rome. The reason you don't know much about that is because two things. One, the German army left Rome to the Allies, and they picked up a better defensive position. And happened, I think, not long before D-Day, which kind of overshadowed Clark's mission. But southern Italy had been captured by the Allies. The Germans, however, dug in. When Mussolini was overthrown by the Italian people, who were sick of him by this point, and many of them became more sympathetic to the Allies, German troops rescued him and then took him up to North Italy. And those German troops up in North Italy were able to hold on stubbornly throughout much of the war. If you ever saw the movie Von Ryan's Express, it's a fictitious, I think it's a fictitious novel. But anyway, it's an exciting movie starring Frank Sinatra about attempts of U.S. and British forces to escape from a POW camp in Italy and make it over to Switzerland. Exciting movie. By the end of the war, when the Germans finally either had to evacuate or leave, Mussolini was captured by an Italian mob, and he and his mistress were killed and strung up dangling upside down in front of a garage. A very ignoble end. After the war, there's this is what's known as the Cold War era. Italy adopts a parliamentary system, not too different from the way France had their parliamentary systems, and many other European countries had parliament systems. In this system, there is no separation of powers like you see in the United States between the executive branch and the legislative branch, where we separately elect a president, separately elect a legislature. They can be controlled by different parties, as they are now. Even parts of the legislature can be held by different parties. But the prime minister is actually chosen not by the people, but by the lower house of parliament, known as the Chamber of Deputies. And unlike the United States, where our Senate is probably stronger, the upper branch that represents the land, in most countries, the lower house, known as the People's House, chooses the chief executive and the cabinet. There is a Senate of the Republic, just like the United States, and just like the United States, it represents regions. Because remember, most of those countries like Piedmont, Tuscany, Lombardy, they were all used to be separate countries. So the Senate is an area for regional governments, but they don't have as much power as the Chamber of Deputies. So most people, when they talk about the Parliament and where the most of the action is, it's down in the lower house. The pivotal moment, I'm sorry, before I get too far, the rules for them chosen are what's known as proportional representation. So in this system, your vote percentage is pretty close to your seat percentage. You have to get above a certain percentage to get a seat. Most places set it at 2%. And all the remaining votes of parties that don't get 2% are redistributed proportionally among those who get seats. So as you can see, take a closer look at the PowerPoint. You'll get to see the results of the key pivotal 1948 election. And they've got 574 members of the Chamber of Deputies. And the Christian Democrats, or DC, got close to 50% of the vote, just under it. However, when all the seats of parties, because Italy has a lot of parties, if you think about how many different types of tomatoes and food and other things to add, spices, it's no wonder they have so many political parties. Yeah, they had about 48.5% of the vote. But when the remaining votes are redistributed, that was enough to give the Christian Democrats a 53% of the seats, which is enough to govern. And FDP is for the Popular Democratic Front. That's a catchy name for the Communist Party, which, as you can see, is the second largest party. And in fact, at one point, I think they were even stronger. If we add up those seats, 210. In fact, they may have even had more votes than the Christian Democrats coming into the pivotal 1948 election. The Socialists had about 7% of the vote. They're kind of like they were the moderate party. You had other parties going all the way down, but they mostly had like 3 and 2%. And by the way, it says U.S. That's for Socialist Unity, or the Italian pronunciation of it, which you probably don't want me to do. Want to add something to all this, by the way, which is that this pivotal 1948 election where the center-right, that's what the Christian Democrats were, they were right of center. They're not a hardcore right of center like Mussolini types, although there is a fringe party that supports Mussolini-like policies. I remember when I was a college student, one of these parties nominated his granddaughter to be the leader of the party. The Christian Democrats are involved in most of the coalitions. They are the dominant political party in Italy during the Cold War. Although varying times, the communists come closer to rule, the socialists have a fair amount of power, but the socialists and the communists don't always get along. Otherwise, they might have had more chances at government. There were many government collapses. I mean, it seemed like almost every year, Italy would have to form a new government whenever something broke out. And the most pivotal time was a lot of violence in the 1970s, as the Red Brigades, if you remember those groups, they were hardcore communists. They assassinated a prime minister. They killed a socialist writer who I'm sure they thought was insufficiently communist. And they also kidnapped U.S. NATO General James Dozier. Luckily, we rescued him. This was in the late 70s, early 80s. And you also saw the fascist black terrorists, because black was a common wardrobe choice of the Mussolini factions. And this all occurred in the late 70s. In fact, I saw a movie about it when I was in college called Year of the Gun, which documented a lot of the street violence as well as these assassinations. Sometimes nothing more than someone running up with a pistol and killing a person, kidnapping and then murdering people like Prime Minister Aldo Moro, leaving him in the trunk of a car. It was a crazy time for Italian politics. I thought I would share with you a couple posters from the 1948 election. The first shows how important the Italian elections would be. It says king for a day because, for finally you would see elections would be deciding leaders. They wouldn't be kings or dictators, although they'd had a brief experiment with democracy. In the center, I show you 2 ads which have very strong Christian themes about Christian Democrats resisting communists and the Russian bear. On the right side, there's somebody who looks like the Italian version of Karl Marx, local costumes, and then the hammer and sickle itself and the star for the Italian Communist Party. As pivotal time. Now, there are some allegations that the CIA may have played a role in trying to help tip the election to the Christian Democrats. Certainly a story I heard a lot, but don't know how accurate that is or not, or how much of a role they played. Sometimes supporters of the CIA and opponents of the CIA like to exaggerate the role that the CIA actually performs. So take some things with a grain of salt. When I was a college student in the 1990s, right around the time I was visiting Italy, they were even hosting the World Cup, and I was cheering for the Germans, and they won it all. It was exciting. Italy made it to the semifinals. They thought they were going to win it. There was a major scandal when they didn't. An even bigger scandal than World Cup, but not by much maybe, were a whole slew of scandals in the early 1990s, and the 3 major powers or parties, but the most powerful parties were pretty much destroyed by these scandals. The Christian Democrats, of course, lost big. They went from being the dominant party to not even existing anymore. The socialists and communists all suffered. And so what happened was, in 1993, a new set of parties started emerging. Some of the rules were changed. It's called Italy's Second Republic. And all kinds of reforms, but the biggest change was that not all seats would be chosen by proportional representation. They borrowed what's known as the German model. which has some seats are chosen by party list, proportional representation, where party leaders figure out who gets a seat in the Chamber of Deputies. But the other half is chosen by what's known as first past the post or single member district. Now, you're probably a lot more familiar with those ways of picking. So in those kinds of races, whoever finishes first, regardless, you win the seat, no matter how many votes you get. It's also known as winner take all. So in most cases in the United States, if a bunch of candidates are running, like the upcoming Georgia Senate races, the candidate that wins, that finishes first, wins the whole seat. Now, some southern states like Georgia are a little different. If you don't have a majority, they might have a runoff. So there's a big amount of talk about like what will happen in this Johnny Isakson seat. And there you have Senator Kelly Loeffler. She's a Republican. Doug Collins, who's also a Republican. You have Raphael Warnock, who's a Democrat, the Reverend, from Atlanta. And you also have Matt Lieberman and a couple other candidates. If nobody gets over 50%, the top two go to a runoff a couple weeks or months later. Now, they chose this system because Germany had had a relatively stable political system, not as many governments collapsing. So they thought if they brought the German model, maybe that would bring some stability to Italy. Wrong. Not at all. Whereas beforehand, believe it or not, even though you had a lot of leader chaos and you would have coalitions would break up, there was party stability. You always knew there were a Christian Democratic Party, Socialist Party, and Communist Party would be the leaders. Who would be the prime minister specifically, or who'd be in the cabinet, those leaders could rise and fall, but at least you had party stability. Now you have party chaos. Parties are rising and falling as quickly as they change leaders, and you have leader chaos, and you have coalition chaos. So not sure why, but things have gotten much more complicated for Italy than they used to be. Parties don't last very long, just a handful of years, unlike the party stability you saw in the First Republic. Now, I've given you a little bit of a look at the Chamber of Deputies just to show you how the system works. And there you see which states or which parties won proportional representation votes. And some of them obviously won single member district votes. And they have this new thing where Italians abroad can vote. As you can see, some parties benefited from the first past the post. What you also tend to see is coalitions among parties. So there was a center-right coalition formed by at least 4 political parties, like the Northern League and Forza Italia. More about them later. All of the liberal parties, the center-left parties, came together to try and pool their resources to do well in the first past the post, because if you've got like 10, 15 parties, it's going to be a very small percentage to win. It's better to form coalitions. And then you'll notice a group that I'll talk about a little later called the Five Star Movement. It was a populist movement, and they wound up getting the most votes in the most recent election in 2018. A little more about that. But if that map looks really confusing to you, and it doesn't look like many parties won anywhere close to 50% of the vote, you would be right. There's nothing wrong with your eyesight. That's how it is. If you go to slide 8, you look at political parties today. I give you sort of a geographic map. You can see that the center-right parties fare the best in northern Italy. They're in the countryside. The center-left parties, they look really tiny. They tend to do well in the urban areas. Small location, but a lot of people packed in. And this five-star movement, this populist party, represented by yellow, they've pretty much taken over the southern part of Italy. That used to be Christian Democratic territory, whereas the communists would do well in the northern part and the urban areas. Now, the political parties today, the five-star movement is, like I said, is a populist party. It's hard to say whether they're right-wing or left-wing. It'd be almost like if you took elements of Donald Trump supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters and put them together. That's what the Five-Star Movement looks like. And there's even some dissension in the Five-Star Movement. You have the Democratic Party, which is sort of a center-left alliance of some more moderate parties and some of the old-school communist and socialist party stalwarts. You have a group called Lega Nord, which is the Northern League, and it's a North Italy regional party, although as you can see, their support has kind of crept southward. They are anti-European Union, although they're very pro-business. I think they're pro-nationalistic business. And if you've ever been to Northern Italy, you'll know that that's where a lot of the big industry is, as well as some fair-sized towns, whereas Southern Italy is very agrarian. Then you see they have sort of like our Republican Party, Forza Italia, and that was a party of a populist businessman named Silvio Berlusconi, who owned AC Milan. He owned a lot of industries, and because he was super wealthy, and his cable channels were so powerful that we could watch some Italian channels when we were over in Russia, he had them as a dominant political party in the 1990s and 2000s, and even the 2010s. He was never in power for super long, but he would be in and out of power several times. It's kind of like Muhammad Ali being heavyweight champion. He wasn't consistently the heavyweight champion. He'd be in and out a couple of years, but certainly a dominant boxing figure in the 60s and 70s. Out of all these, and those are just four of the biggest parties. There are many others. After the 2018 election, it took them a couple months, about 3 months after the votes were all cast and everyone knew what percentages they got, whereas finally a government is formed. That's also very different from the American system, where we have people who want to know by 10 p.m. that night who's going to be the next president, and we get antsy if we have to wait a day or two, like after the 2004 election, or even the 2016 election, or a month or so after the 2000 election, Bush v. Gore. It's not uncommon to have coalition tactics last several months after an election in a parliamentary system before a coalition takes power. So the Five-Star Movement and the Lega Nord, both populist parties, came together in an alliance. And I know you're thinking, why didn't they get everybody involved, or a whole bunch of them? Well, that means that's like inviting more people to the pizza party, but you only have one pizza. Some people, if you want a bigger slice, don't invite more people, if that makes any sense. And so, in fact, Giuseppe Conte, the current prime minister, comes from Lega Nord. Well, I say this currently now. I don't know if he'll be in power through the end of the month, because Italy is really getting overrun with coronavirus. They have one of the highest death tolls and a fairly high death rate in the world. Five-Star Movement, by the way, I mentioned that they have some Trump-like leanings, some Sanders-like leanings. One of the biggest things that they support is dropping sanctions on Russia. They think that if they did that, and if they become friendlier with Russia, then that would be a good thing for Italy. And that's why Italy's made a very big deal about aid coming in from Russia, and Vladimir Putin is very quick to send aid on out. There have been all kinds of arguments saying that Putin played a hand in helping out the Five-Star Movement get elected. In return, he probably hopes that the Five-Star Movement will get rid of sanctions. So it's not just the U.S. election that we see Vladimir Putin trying to get involved in. And whether you support Trump or not, whatever you think of the Mueller report, certainly there's a mountain of evidence that Russia has been trying to influence the U.S. elections and will continue to do so. The final part of this slide I want to show you too is the very complicated mechanism for decision making in Italy, where groups choose other groups and policy arrows move from spot to spot, and it's very difficult to figure out how legislation is going to move forward. It's very likely that with this complicated system of government and decision making, that may have hampered the country's ability to not only stop the COVID-19 from spreading throughout the country, but also tragedies like the recent destruction of a bridge, I believe it was in Genoa, and whose responsibility it was. The final slide is the last link between the United States and Italy, and this comes from the Economist Intelligence Unit, from the publication by The Economist, and they like to rate countries as to how democratic they are. And it just so happens in their measure that out of all the countries that they rate, both the United States and Italy are tied for 21st in the country, like 21st most democratic, with the identical scores even, not just a rounding issue. Both have a 7.98. Now it's pretty close to what they consider a full democracy. 8 to 10 is the best measure of democracy. As you can see, the United States and Italy are slightly below that. This study has 5 criterion, which include whether elections are free and fair, whether the governments have checks and balances, that's the functioning of government, or does one group try to consolidate power themselves, whether citizens are included in politics, and whether there is support for the government, the political culture, and whether citizens enjoy the freedom of expression or civil liberties. As you can see, the U.S. does some things better than others, or does some things better than Italy, like in terms of functioning of government, though it could be certainly better according to this measure. Political culture is about the same. Italy a notch better on civil liberties, but the function of governance in Italy is certainly below that of the United States. And so both are rated as flawed democracies, though each with some improvement, not by much. I suppose if you round it up, both could be listed as democracies, but it shows that both countries have a way to go before they can be considered fully democratic and living up to the ideals of our Republican constitutions. With that, hope you're safe from this coronavirus, and even if Italy is an unsafe place to go now because of COVID-19, I hope you get a chance to visit the places that you were looking forward to.